When wealth becomes a weapon and desire turns into a trap, how far would you go to break free from silken chains of manipulation? This is a story of power, passion, and betrayal that will leave you breathless. Backhand index pointing right. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment for more. Rachel Morgan sat at her small desk in the corner of her apartment, staring at her laptop screen, but her mind wasn't on the report she had promised to finish. Instead, she replayed the last few minutes over and over, the call that had changed everything. Rachel? The voice had been smooth, confident, the kind that seemed to know its own power. I'm Tony Lancaster. I've been following your work for a while. I think we could create something extraordinary, together. At first, she thought it was a mistake, a scam, or some kind of elaborate joke. She had heard of Tony Lancaster, of course, everyone had. A man whose name carried weight in every corner of the business world, a billionaire whose projects were high-profile, exclusive, and fiercely competitive. The idea that he had personally chosen her felt impossible. Yet here she was, sitting in her modest apartment, staring at the email invitation he had sent. Join me for a discussion on the Arcadia Initiative. Your input will be invaluable. Wednesday, 3 p.m., my office. Rachel's hands shook slightly. Her mind raced with questions and doubts. She was competent, yes, but Tony Lancaster? A man who could command entire industries with a single word? And now he wanted her, specifically, to work on a project that could make or break her career. By the time Wednesday arrived, Rachel had rehearsed her responses, imagined the office, and visualized every possible scenario. She arrived early, dressed in a tailored navy suit that conveyed professionalism without being too flashy. Her hair was pulled back neatly and she carried only the essentials: laptop, notebook, and her carefully honed confidence. The office was everything she had imagined, and more. Expansive, sleek, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city skyline. A single receptionist greeted her and directed her to a glass-walled conference room. And there he was, Tony Lancaster, leaning casually against the table, his presence larger than life. He smiled as she entered, and the room seemed to shrink around him. "Rachel," he said, extending a hand. His grip was firm, assured. "Thank you for coming." "Of course," she replied, trying to sound steady despite the surge of nerves. Tony motioned to a chair, but he didn't sit immediately. He circled the table, observing her with a careful, calculating gaze. "I've read your previous projects," he said. "Very impressive. You have a way of seeing things others miss. That kind of insight, it's rare. And it's exactly what this project needs." Rachel's chest tightened. Flattery always felt like a double-edged sword, and she knew he was aware of how well it would work on her. "I'm honored you think so," she said carefully. Tony finally seated himself, leaning forward, resting his arms on the table. "We're not talking about a small initiative here. Arcadia is big, transformative. It's going to set a new standard not just for the industry but for everything it touches. And I need someone with vision, someone like you." He spoke with the kind of intensity that made it impossible to doubt him. His eyes held her attention, drawing her into the narrative he was weaving, of innovation, success, and a shared vision that only the two of them could bring to life. Rachel found herself nodding, despite a faint whisper in her mind warning her to be cautious. "I'd like to contribute," she said softly, almost unsure if she was agreeing or simply agreeing with the voice in the room. Tony leaned back, a small, satisfied smile playing on his lips. "Good," he said. "But let me be clear, this won't be easy. It will demand everything from both of us: time, creativity, focus. And I expect loyalty. Not blind loyalty but commitment. Trust me, Rachel, I know talent when I see it." Her heart beat faster. His words weren't just a compliment, they were an invitation, a challenge. And somewhere deep down she wanted to accept it, even if she didn't fully understand why. For the next hour, Tony outlined the project in meticulous detail. Every aspect was precise, ambitious, and terrifyingly exciting. Rachel listened, asked questions, and took notes, but all the while she felt a subtle undercurrent, a sense that Tony wasn't just presenting the project. He was testing her, probing her reactions, seeing how she would respond under pressure. At one point he leaned forward, resting his chin on his hand. "Tell me, Rachel, what do you want from this? Ambition alone won't carry you. And talent alone won't survive the competition. What drives you?" The question caught her off guard. She opened her mouth, hesitated, and then spoke honestly. "I want to make a difference. To do work I'm proud of. To be seen for what I can actually do." Tony's smile widened, slow and deliberate, like he had anticipated her answer. "Good. That's exactly the kind of drive I need. because Arcadia will test you in ways you can't imagine. But I promise, if you rise to it, you'll see your work achieve heights few ever reach. By the time she left his office, Rachel felt a strange mix of exhilaration and unease. She was thrilled by the opportunity, terrified by the responsibility, and uncomfortably drawn to Tony himself. His confidence, his presence, the way he spoke as though he could bend reality, it all left her both awed and slightly off balance. Over the next few days, Tony maintained contact with calculated frequency. Brief calls to check on her thoughts, short messages offering praise, subtle corrections, and suggestions that made her feel both capable and dependent on his guidance. He was never overbearing, never cruel, but every word, every gesture, was carefully designed to pull her closer, to make her rely on him for validation. Rachel began working late into the night, driven by the desire to impress him, to prove herself. She knew that this project could define her career, but she also realized, somewhere deep down, that she was no longer just working on Arcadia. She was working for Tony, even if she didn't yet admit it. One evening, after finishing a particularly challenging section of the project, her phone buzzed with a message from him. "You've done excellent work today. I knew I chose the right person. Meet me tomorrow morning, and I'll show you something that will change everything about Arcadia." Rachel stared at the screen, a fluttering mix of excitement and apprehension twisting in her stomach. She knew she was stepping further into his world, into the silken web he was weaving, but she couldn't stop herself. Every instinct told her to be careful, but another, stronger voice whispered, "Maybe this is what I've been waiting for." As she set her phone down and leaned back in her chair, Rachel realized that the project wasn't just a professional opportunity, it was the first step into a dangerous, intoxicating game. And Tony Lancaster had made sure she didn't even see the rules. Rachel arrived at Tony's office the next morning, her nerves a mix of anticipation and unease. The previous day's meeting had left her energized yet unsettled. Tony had a way of making every interaction feel consequential, as if the outcome of their conversation could shape not just the project, but her entire future. The receptionist gave her a small, knowing smile. "He's expecting you," she said. Tony's office, like always, was immaculate. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed a panorama of the city, but Rachel barely noticed the view. Her attention was entirely on him. Tony was already seated at the large, sleek table, a thin stack of papers and a laptop in front of him. He looked up as she entered, and that familiar, disarming smile appeared. "Rachel," he said warmly, gesturing for her to sit. "I'm glad you're here. Today we're going to push Arcadia further than we have before. And I have a feeling you're exactly the person to help me do it." He spoke with such certainty that Rachel felt herself nodding automatically, her mind caught in the rhythm of his words. Tony had a way of turning directives into invitations, and suggestions into irresistible ideas. As they dove into the project, Rachel noticed small, subtle patterns in Tony's behavior. He praised her ideas lavishly, making her feel seen and valued, but he also gently questioned them in a way that planted seeds of doubt. It was never outright criticism, just enough to make her second-guess her instincts and look to him for guidance. "Your approach here is clever," he said at one point, tapping a finger against a graph she had designed. "But have you considered this angle instead?" He slid a revised version of her chart across the table. "I think it could elevate your concept. You'll see, it'll make the impact much stronger." Rachel felt a twinge of irritation but quickly pushed it down. She knew he was right, it did improve the chart. Still, a small voice inside her whispered, "He's controlling me. Why can't I just trust my own instincts?" Throughout the morning, Tony maintained a delicate balance of admiration and subtle guidance. He was never forceful, but his influence was unmistakable. Every suggestion made her feel smarter, yet every praise made her crave his approval even more. She realized she was beginning to measure her own success not by her work alone, but by how he responded to it. By lunchtime, Tony suggested they continue working off-site, at a small, exclusive cafe he frequented. "A change of environment can spark creativity," he said casually. Rachel hesitated for a moment. She wasn't sure she was comfortable blending professional and personal spaces, but something in his tone made her agree. At the cafe, Tony's charm was effortless. He listened intently as she explained her ideas, occasionally nodding, occasionally offering subtle suggestions that made her feel as though the project was a collaboration, not a hierarchy. He laughed at her jokes, asked personal questions that weren't intrusive but carefully intimate, and praised her insights in a way that made her pulse quicken. "You know, Rachel," he said, leaning back and studying her, "most people would be intimidated by this project. By me. But you rise to it. You challenge me. That's rare. That's exactly why I brought you here. Rachel felt a warm rush of pride and something else she couldn't quite name. Admiration? Desire? A strange, fluttering thrill that came whenever he looked at her in that calculating yet intensely personal way. She knew it was dangerous to feel this way, but she couldn't stop herself. Over the next few days, their working sessions became routine. Tony's manipulations were subtle, almost invisible. He praised her consistently, invited her into small privileges, reviewing confidential data, attending private strategy meetings, and carefully framed these as rewards for her competence. Each time Rachel felt more entwined in the project, and in him. He would occasionally test her boundaries. A late evening email, casually suggesting they review some additional data over drinks, or a hand resting lightly on hers while pointing out a detail in a design. He never overstepped in a way that was overtly inappropriate, but he nudged her closer and closer to dependence. Rachel began noticing that her thoughts were increasingly preoccupied with him. She found herself imagining how he would respond to her ideas before she even presented them. She thought about his approval, his subtle smiles, the way he seemed to understand her in a way no one else did. It was intoxicating and yet disorienting. One evening, after a particularly long session, Tony suggested a private presentation of their progress in his office. As they sat across from each other, he leaned forward, resting his chin on his hand, his gaze fixed on her. "Rachel," he said softly, "I've been thinking. Arcadia isn't just about the project. It's about us, our dynamic. You understand things I don't see sometimes, and I guide you where you hesitate. We balance each other. Do you feel that too?" Rachel's breath caught. It was an acknowledgement of something she had been feeling but hadn't named. Yes, she admitted quietly. "I feel that too." Tony's smile was slow, deliberate, and triumphant in its subtlety. "Good," he said. "Because that connection, that understanding, it's what will make Arcadia exceptional. And it's what makes this worth doing, worth everything." By the time she left his office that night, Rachel felt a strange combination of exhilaration and unease. She had gained Tony's approval, advanced the project, and felt herself drawn ever closer to him. But she also sensed the invisible threads he was weaving around her. She tried to rationalize it, telling herself that admiration for a mentor, passion for a project, and professional dedication were harmless. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that Tony was always one step ahead, guiding her thoughts, shaping her reactions, and whether she realized it or not, pulling her into his control. Over the following weeks, the pattern deepened. Rachel worked late nights, often under Tony's guidance, responding to his subtle nudges, following his suggestions, craving his praise. She began to rely on him, not just for direction on the project but for confidence in herself. Tony had built a web so delicate and precise that she didn't notice the strands tightening around her, threads made of flattery, privilege, and the intoxicating thrill of being seen by someone as formidable as him. And every time she tried to pull away to remind herself that this was just a project, Tony would offer another small reward. A compliment, a privilege, an acknowledgement that made her feel indispensable. It wasn't coercion in the traditional sense, it was far more subtle, far more dangerous. He had her enthralled without her even realizing it. Rachel knew, somewhere deep down, that this entanglement was risky. That Tony's charm masked a sharp, calculating mind. That her ambition and desire were slowly being redirected by his will. But the thrill of it, the excitement, the undeniable connection, was too intoxicating to resist. She was caught in Tony's silken web, and with every passing day the threads drew tighter. The city hummed below Rachel's apartment window, but her mind was far from the skyline. For the first time in weeks she felt a flicker of doubt, not about the Arcadia project itself but about Tony Lancaster. It had started subtly. Little moments she had brushed off as encouragement or mentorship now felt more like control. The way he praised her then suggested slight adjustments. The way he asked personal questions, not intrusive but carefully probing. Even the way he seemed to anticipate her ideas before she voiced them. She felt herself measuring everything through his approval, a thought that made her chest tighten. Rachel had tried to ignore it at first, convincing herself that Tony's behavior was harmless, that he genuinely valued her input. After all, the project was massive, and his attention had helped her elevate her work in ways she couldn't have imagined alone. She reminded herself of the late nights spent perfecting designs, the small victories, and the rush of excitement when he smiled approvingly at a completed section. But doubts persisted. During one particularly long session at his office, Rachel realized that the project's direction was no longer hers. Every suggestion she made was subtly redirected. Every idea she thought she originated seemed to have been anticipated by Tony, who presented it as a collaborative improvement rather than her own. She felt a pang of frustration, masked carefully behind her professional composure. "Rachel," Tony said, leaning over the table with a casual smile that made it impossible to resist listening, "this section is good, but if we tweak the presentation this way, it will resonate even more. You know how important perception is, right?" "Yes, of course," she replied, though inwardly she bristled. It wasn't that his suggestion was wrong, it wasn't, but it was always about his way. Always about control, subtly wrapped in charm. As the days passed, Rachel began to notice how dependent she had become. She thought about Tony's reactions before every email, every presentation, every small decision. The realization was unsettling. Her independence, her instinctive confidence, had quietly shifted. She had been pulled into a rhythm set entirely by him. It was during a late evening meeting, alone in Tony's office, that she finally confronted the feeling she had been avoiding. "Tony," she began cautiously, adjusting the stack of papers before her. "I've noticed, sometimes I feel like my ideas aren't really my own. But I'm following your lead more than I'm contributing." Tony looked at her, his expression calm, almost unreadable. A faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Rachel," he said gently, "that's the thing about collaboration. It's about blending strengths. You see, I provide guidance and you bring your vision. Together, we elevated beyond what either of us could do alone." His words were carefully crafted, reassuring, but Rachel wasn't convinced. She hesitated, trying to articulate the growing unease gnawing at her. I just want to make sure I'm contributing authentically. That I'm not just following your cues." Tony leaned back, hands clasped, studying her as if weighing her very thoughts. "You are contributing, Rachel. You always are. But sometimes, perception matters more than originality. And you, more than anyone, understand how to make people see brilliance. That's why you're essential to Arcadia." Rachel felt a chill run through her. Essential, yes, but essential on his terms. She realized then that Tony had been guiding her subtly from the very beginning. Each compliment, each praise, each suggestion, it wasn't mentorship. It was manipulation. For the first time she felt a spark of resistance. She wanted to assert herself, to reclaim her ideas, her confidence, and her agency. But the thought of doing so filled her with anxiety. She knew Tony would respond, charm, persuasion, subtle guilt, but she wanted to test her limits. The opportunity came the next day. During a presentation with the board, Tony suggested a direction that she instinctively felt was weaker than her original plan. Her stomach twisted, but this time she spoke up. "Tony," she said, steadying her voice, "I understand your approach, but I believe my version better aligns with the project's goals. I think it will resonate more with the board." Tony's eyes met hers, and for a moment, the room felt electric with tension. He didn't smile. He didn't frown. He simply studied her, his expression inscrutable. "Very well," he said finally, a slow nod acknowledging her decision. "Let's see how it plays out." It was a small victory, but for Rachel, it was monumental. She had asserted herself, challenged him, and survived. And though she knew Tony would continue to influence her, she realized she had the power to resist. Over the next few days she began testing boundaries in small ways, adjusting parts of the project without asking, introducing her own ideas earlier in meetings, subtly redirecting discussions. Each time Tony responded predictably, sometimes with praise, sometimes with quiet correction, but Rachel felt more grounded in her own competence than she had in weeks. Yet the entanglement was not easily severed. Tony's influence had seeped deep, and moments of doubt continued to creep in. A casual compliment, a thoughtful gesture, even the way he looked at her across the table, each tugged at her focus, reminding her of the delicate web he had spun. She was aware now, more than ever, that their dynamic was as intoxicating as it was dangerous. One evening, after another long session, Rachel sat alone in her apartment, reviewing notes and reflecting. She realized she had been dancing on a knife's edge, thrilled by the opportunity, captivated by Tony's charm, but increasingly aware of how finely tuned his control had become. Her phone buzzed with a message from him. "Great work today. I've arranged a private meeting tomorrow to discuss the next phase. You'll want to see this. Arcadia is about to change everything." Rachel stared at the screen, a mixture of excitement and wariness churning in her stomach. She knew she was being drawn deeper into his orbit, but now for the first time she understood the stakes. She could no longer deny it. Tony Lancaster's influence was pervasive, subtle, and deliberate. And the question now was whether she could maintain her independence, or whether the silken chains were already too tight. For the first time, Rachel felt a spark of defiance, a quiet determination. She would continue working with him, she decided, but on her own terms, testing boundaries, asserting ideas, and reclaiming control wherever possible. She knew it would be difficult. She knew it might be dangerous. But she also knew that if she didn't take this step, she would be lost entirely in his web. Arcadia had become more than a project. It was a battlefield, a test of will, a measure of independence. And Rachel was ready to fight, quietly, carefully, but relentlessly. Tony Lancaster had woven his web with precision. Now, Rachel Morgan was beginning to find the edges, and she was determined not to be trapped. The morning sunlight spilled across Rachel's desk, highlighting the neat stacks of papers, her laptop, and the careful notes she had prepared for the final Arcadia presentation. Today was decisive, not just for the project but for her. Weeks of late nights, delicate negotiations, and subtle manipulations had brought her to this moment. She had worked closely with Tony Lancaster, endured his charm, his calculated influence, and his carefully crafted guidance. But she was no longer the same Rachel who had entered his office timidly, eager for approval. As she walked into Tony's office, he looked up with that familiar, confident smile. "Rachel," he said, standing and offering his usual handshake. "Ready for the final review?" She met his gaze steadily, noting the faint flicker of curiosity. He hadn't yet sensed how firmly she had reclaimed her footing. "Yes," she replied, voice calm and measured. "I've prepared the final iteration, but I'd like to present some adjustments of my own." Tony raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "Adjustments?" he asked, leaning against the table. "I'm listening." Rachel began her presentation, her words confident, deliberate. She walked him through the sections she had reworked, areas where her own insight had improved the project, where her instincts had driven better solutions than the suggestions he had made. She framed her contributions professionally, yet assertively, ensuring that every idea carried her authorship and vision. Tony listened quietly, his expression unreadable. Occasionally he asked a question, not to undermine her but to probe her reasoning. Rachel anticipated each one, prepared with clear explanations and strong justifications. She felt the subtle thrill of control, of standing firm against the influence that had once felt inescapable. "You've thought this through," Tony said finally, his voice measured, his smile subdued. "I see the improvements. Well done." Rachel nodded, suppressing the rush of satisfaction. "Thank you. I wanted to ensure Arcadia reflected both the vision we set out to achieve and the innovations I contributed. This is my perspective." Tony studied her for a long moment. She could feel his mind turning over her words, trying to gauge whether he could still influence her. But he didn't push. He didn't charm. He simply acknowledged her authority in the project. It was a small concession but a critical one. Over the next few days, Rachel continued to assert her independence. She took charge of team meetings, made decisions confidently, and implemented ideas without waiting for Tony's approval. Each time she acted decisively, she felt the silken chains Tony had woven around her loosening, as though each act of autonomy cut a thread. It wasn't easy. Tony was observant, and he tested her occasionally, subtle suggestions, a question that implied doubt, or a compliment wrapped in expectation. But Rachel had learned to recognize his patterns, to see his charm for what it was. She responded professionally, politely, without allowing herself to be swayed emotionally. One evening, as they finalized the last components of the Arcadia project, Tony leaned back in his chair and studied her. "You've grown remarkably," he said. "I always knew you had potential, but this is beyond what I expected." Rachel held his gaze evenly. "Thank you, Tony. I've learned a lot working on this project. But I've also learned the importance of trusting my own instincts, and recognizing where influence crosses into manipulation." Tony's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of surprise, perhaps respect. He was quiet for a moment before nodding. "I see," he said finally. "Well, you've certainly proven yourself. Arcadia wouldn't be what it is without your input." The acknowledgement was satisfying, but Rachel didn't need his validation anymore. She had her own sense of accomplishment, her own confidence in her abilities. The final presentation to the board was scheduled for the following day, and she knew that she would walk in as an equal partner, not as someone tethered by subtle influence or charm. The day of the presentation arrived, and Rachel stood at the front of the boardroom, facing a room full of decision-makers. Tony sat beside her, a silent presence, but it no longer intimidated her. She spoke clearly, confidently, and authoritatively. Every point she made reflected her vision, her understanding, and her strategic thinking. The board responded positively, nodding, asking questions, and clearly impressed. When it was over, Tony turned to her, his expression unreadable but respectful. "Well done, Rachel." "Truly." Rachel smiled, not because of his praise but because of herself. She had taken control. She had asserted her independence. She had walked through the web he had spun without being ensnared. In the days following the successful presentation, Rachel and Tony's dynamic shifted. They still collaborated, still shared ideas, but the subtle manipulation, the charm used as control, had lost its power. Rachel interacted as an equal, assertive and confident, and Tony adjusted, perhaps realizing that not everything could be influenced, not every mind could be swayed. Rachel took moments to reflect on what had happened. The thrill of working on Arcadia, the excitement and danger of being drawn into Tony Lancaster's orbit, and the lessons learned. She realized that ambition could be intoxicating, that charm could be manipulative, and that desire could complicate professional judgment. But she also realized her own strength, the ability to recognize manipulation, to assert herself, and to reclaim autonomy. Walking out of Tony's office one last time before a final project milestone, Rachel felt a sense of liberation she had not experienced in weeks. Arcadia was complete, her contributions recognized, her professional identity intact, and her independence restored. She didn't need to erase the experience, nor did she need to sever ties completely. Tony Lancaster had been a formidable opponent in subtle manipulation, but he had also been a teacher in ways she hadn't anticipated. She could take what she had learned, carry it forward, and step into future opportunities with confidence and wisdom. The silken chains had loosened. The web had been tested. And Rachel Morgan had emerged stronger, wiser, and unbound. As she walked into the city streets, the sunlight reflecting off the glass towers, she felt a lightness in her step. The world was full of opportunity, full of challenges, but now she knew she could face them on her own terms. Tony Lancaster's influence had shaped her journey, but it had not defined her. She was free. And for the first time in weeks, Rachel allowed herself a smile, pure, confident, and entirely her own.